So welcome everybody. It's really nice that you found some time to come and join us. It's quite a small room, so stick your hand up if you want to ask anything, or if you don't recognize me or something. For those who don't know me, my name's Dave. I work for VMware on the Spring team, and let's see, what can I say about myself? I live in London, you can probably tell. And I've been coming to these shows, I guess, since about 2006, when I joined the team. And today, I'm going to talk to you about something that I don't actually know very much about, but I know about Spring. It's the other side I don't know that much about. So actually, if anybody already is using OpenAPI, stick your hands up. Okay, that's a good, I can probably learn from you. Please let me know if there's anything that I'm not covering or you'd be more interested to hear about. So most of this I'm going to do by building an app and showing you the tools. That was the idea, so it's kind of demo based, but I'm just going to have a few slides at the beginning. Oh, introducing myself, fine. That's the Twitter handle, Spring team webpage, and there will be, so the code that I write during the demo, it will end up, it's already there in GitHub, OpenAPI demo. So what are we going to cover? Since most of you put your hand up, I probably don't need to tell you what OpenAPI is, but we'll look at a few examples and get a feel for it, especially for the people who haven't used it. Who is using it? I mean, that obviously we can answer the question between us, but there are some interesting observations there, hopefully. And then I'm going to give you a little catalogue of common usages, the way that people build and use apps with Spring and OpenAPI that I've discovered through having an interest in it, not being an expert, but going and talking to people who, if I find anybody who says they use OpenAPI, I ask them what they do and why they do it that way and not the other way, and things like that. So there's quite a large set of OpenAPI infrastructure, real estate in VMware. So like a large part of VMware, vCloud, vSphere even. There's lots of APIs in there. A lot of them are heavily oriented around OpenAPI. So I found a lot of interesting war stories from those people. And then, what are the tools? What is available with Spring? And that'll be where I jump into the demo, basically. Okay, so first of all, what isn't OpenAPI? Hopefully nobody misread the agenda and came hoping to hear about that other stuff that everybody's talking about. So I'm not going to be talking about any of that. No prompt engineering, no generative AI, no large language models. It's something different. So you could think of it as, it used to be called Swagger, right? Swagger was kind of a de facto standard, and they turned it into more of a formal standard. So you can think of it as, in some ways, embodied in a YAML or a JSON document. So it's a sort of descriptor for an API. And it, in my experience, correct me if I'm wrong, it seems to be more or less exclusively for HTTP APIs. Anybody know any OpenAPI use cases that aren't HTTP? Yeah. So it looks like this. There's a YAML document or there's a JSON document, and you can find lots of really good examples. And that's, I think, what makes it interesting, right? Because there are so many people using it, like more than half the people in this room, that it becomes sort of a common currency. So I've got one here which is Wizard World API. That's a Harry Potter themed API, which I think is kind of cool. There's one here which is Cat as a Service. So, so it gives you pictures of cats random cats, you know. Who wouldn't like that? And one that's perhaps a little bit more practical, this one, date.nature.at, is an international date formatting and time zone API, so you can ask for the time in Sydney and that sort of thing. It's cool. So if we looked at one of those, I don't know, well, let's do the cats, because we like cats, everyone likes cats. So that's a link to an actual website, right? So you could, you know, go to the website, ask for a cat, but there's an API, of course, and here's some documentation for it, which is kind of individual for this API, right? So that somebody generated this, probably from the JSON, right? So you can do this JSON to documentation process, which is one thing that makes it quite useful. Here's the ubiquitous Swagger UI, right? Everybody familiar with this? Anybody not seen one of these? So it's nice, right? It's sort of standardized. You get a list of endpoint paths, HTTP verbs, you can browse into them, you can see what parameters the query parameters are accepted on this endpoint. You might be able to see a request body, and you could get to see example responses. So this one, let's see what happens if you try it out. So I can do get. Ooh, where is it? There's an execute button. There we go. Execute. There we go, and it gives you a picture of a cat. How nice, right? So I think, you know, is that what people use this for, right? I mean, like, it's for discovery, right? People publish their APIs where they expect other people to come and do this kind of thing. That's what it's for, right? Yeah, people are nodding, so I think I got the right end of the stick there. I don't know if you know about this, but I found this quite useful as well. There's a browser plugin that does the same thing. So if I was to copy that link there. So this is, sorry, I could have made that bigger. Can everybody see that? If I paste the cat's JSON endpoint into the browser plugin, I get the same thing, right? So I quite like that, because then I don't have to worry about publishing this page in my application. I can just publish the JSON and everybody knows how to consume it. There are some IDE tools as well. I'll probably show you those later. Everybody's happy because they know what it looks like, right? That's, I think, kind of the biggest value proposition for this stuff. Let me see if I can make that full screen. Maybe not. Oh, there we go. Okay, fine. So that's that page. So continuing with the what is OpenAPI theme. So it's a specification for essentially HTTP APIs. So you get to see available endpoints, input parameters, or the request and response bodies, authentication methods. You can get metadata like contact information. Who do you yell at if this doesn't work? That kind of information. You might see licenses, terms of use, that kind of thing. You also see links to additional documentation if people, make a really good job of this. And there are extension points. There's quite a big spec. So I'm not going to cover many of those features today. I'm just going to show you basic Spring usage, basically. And then that's a link to the schema spec on openapis.org. And this one is, I like this one. So there's an official OpenAPI generator project. You can find it on GitHub. I'll show you a link in a minute anyway. It also has its own API, which is kind of a neat idea, right? So this is the Swagger UI for an OpenAPI generator. So I can generate a client, I can generate a server, right? So I can give it a YAML or a JSON, and it'll give me Java code, for instance, or HTML documentation, right? So that's an API to process open APIs, which I kind of like. I like the meta-ness of that. Okay, so what we have is you've got YAML or JSON, which is defined by a schema, which describes your API, and you can transform that into other useful things. You might get, documentation. You might get even other API descriptors. I've seen that as well. I'll talk about one of those examples in a minute. Or you could turn it into code in different languages, and I think that's another thing that is quite attractive to people who use these tools. It's, at least in principle, polyglot. Nobody really cares how you implement the client and the server, as long as it has the schema. So in terms of who uses it and kind of why I decided to do this session at Spring 1, we noticed in this State of Spring Survey 2022, did anybody see that when it came out? It came out actually probably earlier this year. There's a link to it there. And we asked everybody who did the survey. There were thousands of responses, so it's usually quite useful data. And I noticed 3 things jumped out at me from this question. 3 things that grew in 2022, well, since the last one, between 2021 and 2022. One of them was GraphQL, which is on the slide, and that's kind of expected because we had a Spring GraphQL, product launch in that time frame, so we expect more people to be using it. Another one was gRPC, which is another little pet project of mine. So there is a smaller number, that's why it's not on the graph here. There's a smaller number of people using gRPC, but it grew. It grew fairly substantially in this 2021-2022 period. But look at that, OpenAPI. Not only did it grow, but it's now quite a sizable majority of people who use Spring say that they are using OpenAPI. Now, I don't know how you interpret that. I guess my guess is if I was answering that questionnaire, I would think, well, maybe I don't use it every day, maybe I do, I don't know, but do I know anybody who uses it in my organization? So it might be a fairly loose definition, but a lot of people use it. And I think that's confirmed, I guess, by the hands that went up at the beginning when I asked the question. Lots of people use it. Lots of people use it to communicate internally. I think that was the pattern that I saw at VMware. They do publish public APIs, but I think their biggest driver for adopting it was just organizing a large set of services internally inside a product, right? There might be hundreds of them. If you've seen what vSphere is like, right, and vCloud, they're big, complex products. So they use OpenAPI as a language to talk between teams in that sort of microservices architecture. So there are some patterns, right, obvious patterns. The first obvious patterns are, do you write code first? Do you write your Java? And then transform that into JSON YAML? Or do you write the schema, the JSON YAML first, and transform that into everything else? So those are 2 options, and they're both, fairly well supported. You could do either. Or you might do this, which is actually what I found in the big VMware teams that I talked to. They actually told me they started doing everything API first. They started with the YAML, and they tried to generate everything from that. And they said they couldn't do it forever. It just became too hard to keep the 2 lined up. So there were always things that they needed in the So they're generating Spring APIs, basically, Spring servers on the server side. And there were just so many different features in the HTTP stack, in the servlet stack, right, Spring MVC, that they wanted to use, but they couldn't express cleanly in the JSON, in the YAML. So the YAML just got more and more overloaded with comments and metadata that was then used in a special generator, and it just became very messy, they said. So they went and turned it upside down, and so now they just write Spring MVC services. They generate YAML from that, and then they use that to generate everything else. So the clients, polyglot clients, mainly Java, but polyglot clients, and the documentation. And they don't just use the Swagger UI, they actually do generate. So if you look at the VMware public API documentation, you can tell that it's generated from OpenAPI, but it isn't the Swagger UI. It's something that's a bit more stylized, with a bit more detail in it, a bit more metadata, I guess. And another pattern that I saw in that team and others as well was a sort of a gateway pattern. So you end up with a big, collection of microservices, and they may each provide OpenAPI specifications, but that doesn't help you if you're trying to consume them all as a unit, as a whole, right? And so what you would do kind of with the HTTP side of things is you'd build a gateway, right? You'd put a gateway in it, and you would direct requests to the backends according to whatever business rules you want to make up. But what you'd then like to do is have a single OpenAPI specification that you can present to your clients that is kind of aggregated from all of the little ones. And I haven't found any sort of standard tools for this. Does anybody know of any? Everybody I've spoken to who did this basically wrote their own kind of automation to do the aggregation. And you can do things like, so you can add tags, metadata descriptors into the YAML, and then you can use those to pull things together. And the reason they do that is it's not just the gateway, it's also to segregate different areas of the API. So you might have a big set of microservices, and some of what they provide is, if you like, externally facing, it's public, and some of it is more of an internal API. And they're all in the individual specifications for each of the backend services. But the public view that you want of that might be a selection, just a few endpoints, maybe the ones that require specific user roles, for instance. And you do that by tagging everything in the YAML, in the specification, and then aggregating based on the tags. And you'll see, I won't show you how to exactly do that, but I'll show you the metadata features at least. So what tools are available if you're going to use Spring? Well, we don't provide any directly from the Spring engineering team. I have been involved in the upstream projects here. Actually, not the small Rye one, but the other ones I've contributed to. So because I'm sort of interested, and that's how I show interest. But they're quite happy on their own, basically. So I'll show you each of these, basically, in the demo that I'm going to do in a minute. There's a small Rye OpenAPI thing that is aware of Spring and can generate schemas from Spring MVC code, basically. There's a thing called Spring Docs, which kind of took over from Spring Fox. Did anybody ever use Spring Fox? It was a great little project, but they just stopped maintaining it, basically. So OpenAPI 3 came out, and Spring Fox never kind of made the jump. So I don't know if it was people from Spring Fox that took over, but Spring Docs took over where they left off, and it's a lovely little project. There's lots of good stuff in there. So you can generate schemas, you can generate documentation from Spring MVC code, basically, using Spring Docs. And then there's this sort of official, this is what I call the official OpenAPI generator. I showed you the API documentation for it, right, earlier on. And that's a big project on GitHub. It's got a lot of contributors, a lot of open issues. It looks kind of messy. It's a big pile of mustache, basically. So it's lots of templates for generating all kinds of languages, all kinds of options. So even within Java, you've got a huge range of configuration options. You can generate Spring, you can generate, REST Easy, you can generate REST template, web client. You can generate, the new thing in Spring 6 with the declarative, like Feign, that thing, right? The interfaces, HTTP interfaces, you can do that. So it sort of sits in the both in the code first and the API first space, whereas SmallRye and Spring Docs are both in the code first space. So you basically take the code and generate specs from it. Right, so with that, I think I can start showing you some stuff. What am I doing? About halfway through, that's good. So this is the project that I put on GitHub that you could poke around at later on your own. Instead of just showing you that, what I'll do is I'll generate a new one and just build it up from nothing, because that's the kind of guy I am. Spring Web, and I'm going to add validation. Those are the two things that I kind of need from initializer, if I'm not mistaken. So I'm going to generate into this folder and open up that. So that's now just an empty Spring Boot project from start.spring.io. So we know how that works, right? So let me create a REST controller. So I'm going to start with the code first using SmallRye. I'll tell you why in a minute. So REST controller class manual controller, because I'm writing it manually. I'm going to put a request mapping at the top. Yeah, it's already guessed. I'm using Copilot. Did you notice that? So it already knew what I was going to do because I've done it before. It's kind of clever like that. I'm not 100% satisfied with Copilot, by the way. Sometimes I can do things that it doesn't seem able to, but that was fun. And then I'm going to do a get mapping. Let's keep it simple. And I'm going to say it produces application JSON, so he knew I was going to do that. And I'm going to return a POJO. See, it's making suggestions and I didn't like them in that case. It's kind of wrong, isn't it? All right, so that should be enough actually. And then I just need to create this POJO. So I've got a shortcut for that. All right, so it's just a simple one field, one property JSON object. So everybody knows what happens when I run this, right? I don't need to do that. I'm just going to get JSON out. So what's interesting is what I can do to generate some OpenAPI stuff from that. So the first thing I can try, which is really super easy, is this. So SmallRye. Anybody use SmallRye? I found it quite satisfying because of this, right? Because I didn't have to add anything to my class path. It's purely a build time step. It goes in, it looks at all of your Spring MVC annotations, and it generates some YAML. So let's have a look at how it works. So if I do maven install, there you go. See, did you see? It generated a schema. So all I had to do was tell it which goal to use, and it will put them in target generated. So there we go, JSON and YAML. So I'm actually going to copy that up into the top level of the project, because then I'm going to play with it. Okay. So let's have a look at it while we're there. Everybody see that? Okay. It's not such a big room, right? So go away. Kubernetes getting excited. It knows I'm going to use it later. Yeah, me. So there's my get endpoint, right? And it's saying, oh, look, while I'm here, look, I can see I've got some IDE tooling here, so it's popped up those little code lenses. So I could, even here, I can do a sort of focused Swagger UI. That's a nice feature of this particular plugin that I'm using. The other thing I can do, I guess, is I can preview it here. So that's the same basic Swagger UI, but that's built into VS Code now through an extension. So I could do the same tricks with that. So which version of this file am I editing? Let's look at the one that I want to edit. So this is the file I generated. And I could use this now. I could, publish it. I could give it to all my users and say, knock yourselves out, right? Do whatever you want. Generate Python clients, whatever you want to do. But to show you some of the other things you can do, I'm going to edit it. So I'm going to make in addition to the manual endpoint, I'm going to make one called /generated, right? Because I'm going to generate the server code for that. But I'm going to leave everything else the same, I guess. Yeah, I'm going to leave everything else the same. And then, so to do the generation, I'm going to use that official generator project, which has a Maven plugin, a Gradle plugin, anything you want, in addition to that API that I showed you. Now, the Maven plugin doesn't use the API, the HTTP API, it just uses a Java library, but it functionally is the same. So let me see if that works. OpenAPI plugin. So there's the plugin configuration that I prepared earlier. So I'm going to generate a server. And I'm going to use a Spring generator, which means that I'm going to generate Spring MVC code. I have to tell it that I'm using Spring Boot 3, because this is an older project and they still support older versions of Spring Boot. So I want to use the Jakarta E namespace, all that stuff, right? And that's an option. You'll see what that is when I've generated the code. And then I'm also going to generate a client so that we can play with interacting with the server once I've built it. And that looks like that. So I'm going to use, for that, Jakarta EE and REST template. I can use other HTTP clients if I just configure them. And so both of them are going to look at that OpenAPI YAML I just created, or just stole from small rye. And let's have a look at how that works. So to make it actually successful, I'm going to have to add some annotations, some dependencies. So that I've got another shortcut for that. And I think I also need Swagger annotations. Those will be added to the code that's generated. So I just need those on the class path so that I can compile what it generates when it's finished. Okay, so fingers crossed. Anybody see anything I've done wrong? Never. Try that. If it's green, then we're in good shape. That's green, wasn't it? Yeah, okay, so that will have created a new target generated sources OpenAPI. And what it actually generates is a complete project, including pom.xml, Gradle build, everything. So in principle, I could kind of just take that and copy it somewhere else and then use it as a library, essentially. But But instead, I'm just going to use it. I'm going to use it in situ, as it were. So these source files here, source main Java, have been added to my class path. So the plugin did that. I've got the server in the API package, and I've got the client in the client package. So I'll look at the server first. So the first thing I notice is there's another model.java, right? So my model Pojo has been translated into another DTO type object with the same name. That's fine, I can deal with that. And the other thing it has is this generated API, which is it's tagged as @generated, and it's got @requestMapping methods, right? So what I have to do to actually finish this off, so it doesn't know my business logic, right? It's not going to pretend that it knows my business logic. What I have to do to finish it off is provide an implementation of that interface. So I'll do that. I'm going to call it standard. Oops. Generated API. So generated API is the interface that it implements. Yep, and I'm going to implement generated API. I'm going to want to import that. Why isn't because I told it not to. No, excuse me. I made a stupid error there. I told it not to rebuild the class path, didn't I? What am I going to do? Oh, I guess I'll just reload it. Should be fairly quick. I shouldn't have done that. I'm going to regret it. Okay, so that's the interface that was generated by the generator, the OpenAPI generator. And to do that, so I just need to implement a method, generator get. And it returns a response entity, so it's kind of a generic Spring MVC endpoint, right? So I can return a response entity. OK of new model is great, yeah, but I want to actually set a message in there as well, don't I? So model equals new model dot set value hello Spring 1. So we'll be able to see that that's the one. Oh, I wonder why it thinks it's 2021. It does make some strange choices sometimes. And that's the reason I don't actually like it yet, is because when I'm writing Java, the IDE, the IntelliSense, will get better answers than the code generator, than Copilot. Copilot often shows me something quite plausible. Yeah, that looks like it might work, but then it turns out it implemented a method that didn't exist, or you just use an API that doesn't exist. It's just really guessing. It's impressive. It looks good, and it's syntactically correct. They got that right, but it just doesn't compile. You'd think they could, somehow fix that. Anyway, there we go. So that now is. Oops, sorry. What am I trying to do? Just organize my imports. There we go. So, anything I've forgotten? I don't think so. Let's run it. Okay, it's running, so I should be able to just curl it, right, and see the output. This won't be surprising to you, but because it's generated, it's probably worth checking that it works, right? So generated, this is the one that I generated. Oh dear. Do I need to? I didn't think I needed to add this, but I can't think of a reason why that's not working. There's another thing that I can add that may fix it. I'm having problems because I screwed up that. So this is the Spring Doc API dependency. And I'm going to need that anyway in a minute, so if this fixes my problem, then I guess I'm happy. I'm also going to be really cautious with this now. I think I probably should try and yeah, that's the thing that I don't want. So that hopefully that will... That was the thing I thought I was doing, not the thing I actually did. Okay, so now let's run it again and see if it works better. I haven't forgotten to save something, have I? Don't think so. All right. Ha! Oh, I know what I did, I think. Yeah, I forgot to put, I need at least at component, but I think I actually need at rest controller. That was obvious really, wasn't it, in retrospect? So let's see if I take that out now, if it still works. Yes, this time yes. Still got time, we're fine. Okay, yeah, I know. All right, it's running. And it's there, hello Spring 1. Okay, right, so that's fine, but so far I haven't published the YAML to anybody who wants to consume it, right? I've only used it sort of internally as part of my build process. Well, that's fine, you know, I mean, that's a valid approach, but most people who come to OpenAPI end up wanting to publish the JSON. So that's what that thing did that I just took out. So I'll put it back in now. Yes, I want to do that. And I think I want to shut it down and start it again. Because when I do that, fingers crossed, I believe, let's do it in this browser here, I believe it has a standard, there we go, API docs. There we go. So it's generated its own schema. It's done something that I didn't ask it to, which is add tags, which is interesting. So there's a generated tag which was added by the generator. Right, that's just a kind of standard feature that it does. So I guess I could go back and add a tag to my manual one to make it line up, and I'll show you how to do that if I've got time. So there's the manual one, right? Because it found the annotations, because they're just MVC annotations. So now it's doing the same job as the SmallRye plugin was, right? But it's doing it at runtime, not build time, right? So I had to add that dependency to my class path to get this. I could have just served a static file, it would be the same, but this is actually dynamically updating itself when the app starts, basically. So there's two endpoints, and nicely, they both, even though they didn't have to, I guess, they both, because they're identical models, they end up returning the same object, which is kind of nice. Okay, so there's my generated server. Let's just check that the generated client is going to work as well. So the generated client, we can look at it here, has more code in it, but basically it's this thing, default API. And default API has a dependency on API client. So if I wanted to wire one up, this is what I'd do. I would find the one that I did earlier. Let me open API client beans. So it needs a REST template because I asked it, if you remember, I configured it to use REST template in the generator. So it needs a REST template. I'm going to give the standard Spring Boot answer to where's your REST template. And then it also needs me to create, well, it doesn't need me to create this as a bean, but it needs to create an API client. That's a kind of low level, just JSON schlepping thing, basically. And then the actual HTTP client, the actual sort of business client object, if you like, is that default, what is it called, default API. So let me create one of those as well. And maybe I'll do that in a test. So I will Come on. Auto-wired. There we go. API client. Okay, so I'm going to just inject that one that I just created as a bean and create a new default API with that client. So if that's successful, basically it's worked. And I could write a test that actually uses the client and downloads the response body and asserts it. But the fact that it's green means that everything is happy, right? So the code that was generated is now part of my project. I might come back to that. I might actually finish that test if I have time. In the meantime, I thought I'd just show you what I could do to sort of spice up the specification YAML a little bit. So I mentioned those tags. So now on the class path, I've got this io.swagger.v3 annotations. And so those are independent of Spring Doc and Small Rye. They both use them, and the OpenAPI generator also uses them. So it's kind of a part of the spec, essentially, but the Java side of the spec. So I could say, this is now tagged as manual, and the other one is tagged as generated, right? So if I do that, and then run my build again, do I need to run the build again? Oh, no, let's have a look. Be interesting, actually. Is it still running? No, not still running. There we go. So now I've got a manual tag as well in my manual path. Cool. There's all sorts of other stuff that you can add. I guess that was the message that I wanted to get with that. So this annotation is part of a big set that you can add additional stuff to your YAML. It gets a bit busy sometimes, right? You see generated code that has quite a lot of annotations on it. Like this one had at operation. I could have put that on the other one as well. So that's just there to provide detail, basically. So that all of this could have been guessed, because it guessed the manual one without me having to provide this, right? But they've added that explicitly. What else did I want to do? Oh yeah, right. Last but not least, so there's this thing called Tanzu, and the Tanzu application platform. And I wanted to show you something there, because we're starting to see features in TAP that are OpenAPI oriented. So I thought that was quite interesting. How do I get out of this? There we go. So I have, you can do this yourself if you want to. So there's this thing called Tanzu Academy, tanzu.academy. It's a bit like Spring Academy. If you go there and make yourself, you can just register and have your own password and everything. This thing here, this is new, Developer Sandbox. If you click on that, then it will basically create, I'll show you what it does. It creates you an instance of Tanzu Application Platform, which has a lot of features. You don't have to use them all, but it's basically a Kubernetes cluster. So now I've got a Kubernetes cluster, and yeah, I've got a couple of hours to use. I think that's because I started it earlier today. So they have a short lifetime, and then they get recycled. So you can use this from here. There's a built-in terminal, and there's not going to be anything there because it's a brand new cluster. Oh, interesting. Okay, I don't understand that. But I've got another one that I'm going to use for the demo, so that's okay. Or you could use it locally as well, which is what I'm going to do. So my cluster is More successful. Okay, good. So there's a load of stuff running there. What I've actually done is I've taken the app that I just built, I made it earlier, turned it into a container, published it into this platform. So you can see, for instance, there is an OpenAPI demo service. There's no pod running at the minute. If you're familiar with Kubernetes output, those are the pods. There's no application code running at the minute because it's a Knative service. But I can, from this output here, I can see where it's running. I can see it's running here. So I can wake it up. I can go curl that / generated. And it'll wake the service up. The first response might take a second or two, because it's got to download the container from somewhere. There we go. So I didn't use, it was a different message. It wasn't Hello Spring one. Second time it'll be quicker. And it's also, of course, got the OpenAPI, API docs. Great. So that's just showing you that I can deploy to a cluster, which isn't all that exciting. But if we look at the way that I deployed it, that's when it gets interesting. So I did it with a small YAML file. It's not the minimal one you need for a Spring Boot application, because I've added a feature here. I've added this thing. I say, when you deploy this application to TAP, I want you to register the OpenAPI specification into the TAP system. And I'll show you what that looks like in a minute. And you can provide the JSON here if you want, or you can provide a link to it. But what I'm doing is I'm saying you can download it from yourself, right? Because I'm publishing it on my own v3 API docs endpoint. And so then when I look in this is what the Tanzu application GUI looks like. If I look in there, there's things like, there's a bunch of stuff. But there's metadata about all of the things that are deployed in the platform, right? So there are apps, there are components, there are teams, this is a UI called Backstage. I think it was invented by Spotify. And we publish it as part of TAP. But there's an API category there, and this is what happened when I deployed my application and it had that extra little stanza of YAML at the bottom, this thing here. So when I told it that I wanted an API descriptor, what did it do? It created an API descriptor. Get API descriptors. See, that's a Tanzu object type in Kubernetes. And there is one there, okay. So the fact that it has one of those means that it ends up in this GUI. So you can see how you could use that, right? You could use that to publish information about all of the services that are running on, not just the cluster, because TAP is a multi-cluster system, so this could be a collection of clusters. It's for developers to kind of discover and metadata tag everything, so that you know which team's in charge of which service and what services it provides. And in there, of course, you've got your nice API definition, and I can do the usual try it out stuff, and it'll tell me something, and I guess it'll take a while to launch it if it's passivated again. Anyway, there you go. Yeah, so there's my response. So you've got a sort of a playground that has as many services as you want to be there, basically. There are some other features in TAP as well. There's a thing called an API portal, which is more kind of outward facing. So you would use that to publish all of your OpenAPI specs to an external entity, maybe a different business unit. I don't know, it depends how you organize yourself, right? It might be public or it might be a different business unit, but it's not limited to things that are running in TAP, whereas this is kind of specifically for that. I think I've run out of time, so do come and ask questions, because I'm probably going to get chucked off the stage in about 30 seconds. So come and ask me questions afterwards if you need to, and thanks for coming again.